Welcome everybody to Question of the Week, a Facebook Live session in which I take on your science faith questions. Monday morning, 9:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, 12:30 in the afternoon for those of you on the East Coast. Without any further ado, today's question of the week comes from Stephen Joyner. Stephen, if you're watching last week's broadcast, also had the question of the week as well. So this is the first time we've ever had a back-to-back person providing us with the question of the week. So congratulations, Stephen, for a first here on these Facebook Live sessions. Stephen sent me a link last week asking my perspective on the latest discoveries involving a highly enigmatic hominin called Homo naledi. Recently, researchers provided a date for Homo naledi, and they also discovered more Homo naledi specimens. And of course, this is really exciting news from a scientific standpoint. And so Stephen is interested in my perspective as an Old Earth Creationist on these particular finds and on the question of how does Homo naledi fit into the evolutionary paradigm and what is an Old Earth Creationist to make of these kind of discoveries. So we'll take on those questions in just a minute. But before we do that, I want to remind you that if you're watching this broadcast, please, in the comment section, tell us who you are and where you're watching from. That information is extremely valuable to us. It helps us to understand who this broadcast is reaching and what we can do to be more effective at reaching people with this broadcast. Also, please react to the broadcast with the like button. It's very valuable for you to react to the broadcast. It helps to elevate the visibility of the broadcast, allowing more people to see it in their Facebook streams. So please go ahead and do that. That's a huge help to us. And of course, if you want to offer your perspective on this discovery or on the question of human origins, please feel free to do so in the comment section. In fact, if you disagree with me, your comments are even more welcome than those of you who agree with me, because I want to foster an environment on my Facebook page, whether it is my personal page or my public figure page. I want to foster an environment where people feel like they can discuss science faith issues without any kind of restrictions. So please offer your perspective on this discovery. Okay, well, without any further ado, let's go ahead and take a look at Stephen's question. And I think to do that properly, we probably need to spend just a few minutes laying some background information about Homo naledi. This particular specimen was first reported in the scientific literature in the fall of 2015 by a large team of anthropologists headed up by the controversial and well-known anthropologist from the University of Witwatersrand, Lee Berger. And Lee Berger and his team actually first had access to these hominids in probably 2012, 2013, where a team of spelunkers found Homo naledi deep in a chamber in what's called the Rising Star Cave System that is just outside of Johannesburg, South Africa. And these hominins were discovered in an extremely difficult to access chamber called the Lacetti Chamber. And it turned out that they were able to excavate about 1,500 fossil specimens, which corresponded to about 15 individuals at minimum, adults and juveniles, male and female. This is really unprecedented because it gives us a very clear understanding of the biological diversity of this particular hominid, which is information that's typically lacking but yet desperately needed. We get a sense of the variability of this hominid in a particular location at a particular time. We also can tell differences between male and female, and even information about the growth and development of this hominin because of the presence of juvenile specimens. So an incredibly important find that made quite a bit of news when it was initially reported in 2015. And by the way, we recorded a podcast for our podcast called Apologia, the Ex Libris version of that podcast that I'll make available in the show notes to this broadcast. I also, at the time of this discovery, did a debate with an evolutionary creationist on Justin Brierley's podcast called Unbelievable. I also put links in the show notes to that if you're interested in seeing me interact with an evolutionary creationist about this discovery. Now, what's interesting about Homo naledi is that the researchers, based on the fossils they had, estimated that a male adult would be about 5 feet tall, about 100 pounds, with a brain size about that of a chimpanzee or an Australopithecine, like the creature Lucy, which is an Australopithecus afarensis. They interpreted Homo naledi as a mosaic species that displayed properties of both the Australopithecines, which they would have dubbed as primitive properties, and more advanced features that would be characteristic of later appearing members of the Homo genus, like Homo erectus and archaic Homo sapiens. So, for example, the cranium, the tooth size, the hands, the legs, and the feet all looked like it would have been, again, a member of the Homo genus, but the brain size, the tooth shape, the curved fingers, and the shoulder blades looked like that of an Australopithecine. So it looked like this creature walked erect, but had capability of moving through the trees. It may have had capacity to make tools, given the nature of its hands. The researchers at that time interpreted it, again, as a transitional form, placing it at the transition point between Australopithecines and the Homo genus, arguing that this may have actually been the transitional form that gave rise to Homo erectus, where Homo habilis, Australopithecus sediba, Australopithecus afarensis would have all been rendered evolutionary side branches, and would have dated the age of this hominin to be about 2 million years, given its biological features, given the fact that it was a mosaic form, interpreted as being a key transitional intermediate. Now, another thing that was also interesting was that the location of the Lacetti Chamber was in an extremely difficult to access place within the Rising Star Cave system. There was a long descent followed by a very narrow channel that this creature would have had to crawl through, which is called Superman's Crawl, into an open chamber. It would have had a scale, a large rock formation called the Dragon's Back, before dropping the specimen into a very narrow chamber. And so people argued that this creature was probably caching its dead, was involved in mortuary practices where this chamber, which was loaded with hominin specimens, was likely some kind of burial chamber. And given the fact that it was so difficult to access, it doesn't look like this was a place in the cave where these creatures would have lived. There was no evidence for rubble associated with the fossils, which would have indicated that these remains were washed into that region of the cave. And so the argument was this is likely a mortuary practice. This creature was caching its dead, to use technical language that anthropologists would use. But yet people argued against that because the brain size was not really big enough for people to expect that kind of behavior. Trying to carry the dead remains of a Homo naledi species through the cave system to deposit it would have been extremely difficult, would have required light, which, again, these creatures probably wouldn't have had access to. So there wasn't there was this idea of caching its dead was controversial at the time, but yet there was no other alternative explanation that made any kind of sense. Other people argued that the Rising Star Cave system has undergone an evolution of itself, and that maybe this place was easier to access at one time, or perhaps there were another way into that chamber that we just simply haven't discovered, and that this was a place where Homo naledi was living. But there's no evidence for other faunal remains indicating that these Homo naledi were living there. No evidence in the faunal remains that did exist of butchery of any type. So again, a highly enigmatic find. One of the things that was missing at the time that this discovery was made was the date for Homo naledi. It was in a location in the system that was a very difficult to date location. And so without that date, again, there was quite a bit of speculation about Homo naledi. Well, this is where these new discoveries come into play. Berger and his team of collaborators published 3 papers recently in a journal called eLife. This is also the journal that published the original findings for Homo naledi. The first paper that I'll talk about describes the discovery of more Homo naledi specimens in a different chamber in the Rising Star Cave system. This chamber is dubbed the Lacetti Chamber. Lacetti means light in the local language. And then they also were able to date the age of Homo naledi at the original chamber that was discovered, the Dinaledi Chamber. And then the third paper is a speculative paper discussing the place of Homo naledi in the human evolutionary landscape. So what we'll do is we'll take a look at those first 2 papers, and then as I unpack the third paper, I'll offer my perspective along the way as an Old Earth Creationist as I'm interacting with the evolutionary interpretation of Homo naledi. Okay, so the first paper reports the recovery of another 131 Homo naledi fossils from this Lacetti Chamber, which is also part of the Rising Star Cave system. The entrance to this chamber is distinct from the entrance to the Dinaledi Chamber. In addition to that, there's no apparent connection between those 2 chambers, so this looks like an independent location where Homo naledi fossil remains would have accumulated. It's about a 30-foot descent into the cave system to access this chamber. It, like the Dinaledi Chamber, is very difficult to access, very hard to get to, and so again, similar in character to the Dinaledi Chamber. These researchers, again, discovered 131 fossil specimens that correspond to about 3 individuals at least. An adult and also juvenile specimens are represented. One of the most important aspects of these finds is a specimen known as Neo, which is gift in the local language, that has a very nearly complete cranium, including facial bones. This is a highly unusual find. There's also postcranial remains that are articulated, giving us a better sense of the biology of this creature. And the researchers point out that the characteristics of these fossil remains perfectly fit with what was discovered in the Dinaledi Chamber, that it's giving us insight into facial biology. Neo has a much larger brain size than what was seen in the Dinaledi cave system, indicating the brain may have been a little bit larger than we thought, a little bit larger than a chimp, a little bit larger than an Australopithecine. But the shoulder looked like that of an Australopithecine. So these finds, it essentially affirm the biological and the biological properties of Homo naledi and the population variability observed for Homo naledi based on the original find. It's very clear that Homo naledi is a morphologically homogeneous specimen, clearly distinct from any Homo species or any Australopithecine species. These finds affirm its status as, again, a unique species. Now, the next paper is the paper that is of probably the greatest interest, and that is that the date was determined for the original Homo naledi find. And the researchers that did the work dating this specimen really turned in a piece of work that is science at its very best. They went in and they did a very detailed characterization of the stratigraphical features of the cave. They identified flowstone that was over top of some of the Homo naledi fossils. So it clearly was that flowstone was deposited after the Homo naledi remains were introduced into the cave. They found a layer that seemed to be homogeneous, containing the Homo naledi specimens, and then a clear layer underneath. And they applied multiple dating techniques, employing multiple labs around the world to determine the dates of each of these different layers. And what they determined using uranium thorium dating, optical stimulated luminescence dating, and electron spin resonance is, again, a variety of dates for each of these layers. They also directly dated the Homo naledi remains. So they've got a very robust date for this creature. The flowstone dates somewhere between 235,000 and 250,000 years using uranium thorium dating. The layer that contains Homo naledi using optical stimulated luminescence dating is between 425 and, is between, is 100,000 to 425,000 years in age. The layer beneath the Homo naledi, again using optical stimulated luminescence dating, is between 425,000 and 575,000 years in age, and then the age for the teeth are between 250 and 340,000 years in age. When you put this all together, they argue that the age of Homo naledi specimens in the Lacetti Chamber is constrained between 236,000 to 335,000 years in age. This is a shocking result because based on, again, the anatomical features of Homo naledi, the prediction was that this creature would have been between 2 to 3 million years in age, not 200 to 300,000 years in age. So again, this is a radical result, completely unexpected. Now, what does this all mean for the human evolutionary framework? Well, in the third paper, the authors of the paper basically argue that it's very clear that when anatomically modern humans were around initially, there would have been a diversity of hominids, the Denisovans, the Neanderthals, maybe late appearing creatures like Homo erectus. We have the red deer cave people that are highly enigmatic, found in China. There's Homo floresiensis and now Homo naledi. And so they argue that characteristic of most of the hominid natural history, when modern humans appear on the scene, there's a diversity of hominids. But what's radical is that that diversity includes not only large-brained creatures like Neanderthals and the Denisovans and modern humans, but also small-brained hominins like Homo floresiensis and now Homo naledi. And they argue as a result of this, we need to think of modern humans as a relict species, meaning a species that was part of a larger collection of different species that were related, that was unique in its capacity to somehow survive, whereas all of the other species essentially die off. So this is, again, considered to be a rather significant advance from an evolutionary standpoint. Now, when it comes to the dating of Homo naledi, this is where things really become problematic, I would actually contend, for the evolutionary paradigm, where you could actually argue that the date returned for Homo naledi represents a failed prediction for the human evolutionary paradigm. Again, given its mosaic properties and the fact that much of its skeletal anatomy has primitive features, the expectation was that this creature would have been between 2 to 3 million years in age, and it would have clustered with Homo habilis, Australopithecus afarensis, Australopithecus sediba. It would have been part of that group of hominins that would be in contention to be the transitional form leading to modern humans. It turns out that this doesn't seem to be where you would place now Homo naledi in the evolutionary tree. Instead of being 2 to 3 million years in age, it looks as if it is essentially 200 to 300,000 years in age. I would argue that this is a failed prediction because when you read the original papers that were published regarding Homo naledi, the prediction was based on morphology that this would be the age of the sample based on its phylogenetic positioning in human evolutionary trees. It represents a failed prediction. Now, what's interesting is the response that evolutionary biologists have with regard to that failed prediction is, well, maybe morphology isn't a diagnostic, isn't something that we can use to predict the age of a specimen. But again, this is kind of a concession after the fact. This clearly is not the practice that you see among evolutionary biologists, because if they cannot date hominin remains, they use the morphology to try to, and its phylogenetic positioning, to try to determine its date. In fact, this is a common practice that you see among paleontologists. And recently I reviewed a book by Scott McKnight and Dennis Venema called Adam and the Genome. That review is also is through a Facebook Live post, but also I've written part 1 that was already published last week on my blog, The Cells Design. Part 2 is coming on Wednesday, again in for my Cells Design blog. But is part of the portion of the book that Dennis Venema writes for Adam and the Genome, where he and McKnight make a case for evolutionary creationism. Venema argues that the theory of evolution is a scientifically robust theory, that we shouldn't dismiss it outright because it is a theory that has explanatory power and predictive power. And what he highlights in the first chapter of his 4 chapters that he writes is that when we go to the fossil record, we can actually make predictions where transitional forms should appear in the natural history, in the timeline for the fossil record, and we can also predict their qualities and their characteristics. And so, as an example, he turns to the so-called fissiopods. These are creatures that presumably are transitional intermediates between lobe-finned fish and the very first creatures that occupy the land, tetrapods, amphibians that would have occupied the land. And he argues that the fissiopods lived at the water's edge. They had the perfect mosaic properties of a lobe-finned fish and a tetrapod, and they clearly are documenting an evolutionary transition. So the properties are exactly what you'd expect. They show up in the fossil record exactly where you'd expect them to show up. However, what Dennis Venema fails to point out is a problem very similar to what I'm describing for Homo naledi. When you examine the details, what you see is that these fissiopods are out of sequence. Ones that are more primitive show up later in the sequence. Those that are more advanced show up earlier. And Tiktaalik, which is supposed to be this perfect intermediate between a fishapod and a lobe-finned fish, actually doesn't have digits, where more primitive fissiopods actually have digits. In fact, there's been a discovery of Acanthostega footprints that are 400 million years in age that predate the fissiopods. Now, why this is significant is because Acanthostega is considered to be the first tetrapod, the first true tetrapod. And we have fossil evidence for its first appearance at 365 million years ago, where lobe-finned fish, again, where the first fissiopods appear at about 385 million years. And so in that time regime is where the claim is that the transition from water to land took place, where the fissiopods would have resided. But if we have Acanthostega footprints at 400 million years in age, that's actually before the very first fissiopods appear in the fossil record. This is called a temporal paradox, where transitional forms appear after the appearance of the very first form that they presumably would have evolved into. And so this is a real problem, and I would argue actually represents a failed prediction, where the transitional forms are not where they're supposed to be. In fact, they're out of sequence. They're out of sequence in terms of the specific details of the fishapod sequence, and they're out of sequence with respect to the fact that we have evidence that Acanthostega existed prior to these fishapods. So what's the response? The response is, well, these then clearly are not transitional forms, but there's something like what we think those transitional forms would have looked like. And to think that we could ever discover the true transitional form would be remarkable, given how incomplete the fossil record is. So it's essentially evading the fact that this represents a failed prediction. We see this with feathered dinosaurs. Feathered dinosaurs are supposed to be transitional forms between theropod dinosaurs and the first true birds. But they appear in the fossil record as a temporal paradox as well, after the appearance of the very first true birds, Archaeopteryx and the Archaea ornithines. Things are out of order. And so even though they're dubbed transitional forms, because they have the properties that we would expect, they actually are out of sequence in the fossil record. All that to say the same thing is true with Homo naledi, that it's out of sequence. It's showing up well after what we think it it shows up far later than what we would expect it to show up given its anatomical features and its phylogenetic positioning. Now, how do evolutionary biologists deal with this? Well, this is just an evolutionary side branch. Maybe this creature was alive at that time and gave rise to the Homo genus and then persisted as a side branch from that point on, where it underwent very little or limited evolution. Or maybe this isn't exactly the transitional form, but it's a creature that's like that. So in a sense, what you see happening is evolutionary biologists, I think, evading the fact that this is actually a failed prediction. And it's not unique when we go to the fossil record. There are other high-profile examples, the fishopods, the feathered dinosaurs, that fall into that category of a failed prediction. And so I think this is significant and is a reason for someone like me as an Old Earth creationist to be skeptical of the evolutionary paradigm. The hominid fossil record is a real fossil record. It's describing a real natural history of creatures that existed prior to the appearance of modern humans. They had biological similarity to us, but you could look at that similarity as reflecting common design as opposed to an evolutionary history. These creatures had intelligence, they had emotional capability, fascinating creatures in their own right, but you could argue that these were creatures that were the product of God's handiwork that disappeared after the appearance of modern humans, that there isn't an evolutionary connection. And when you try to establish evolutionary relationships among these hominids, what you see is frustration. There's not a consensus for what the evolutionary relationship would be. Every time there's a new discovery, it creates chaos, and it turns what appear to be well-established ideas into uncertain ideas. For example, these researchers are arguing, given the time frame in which Homo naledi lived, who's to say that Homo naledi wasn't the one that produced the archaeological record that we normally attribute to Homo erectus and other archaic Homo sapiens? And so it now calls into question who is responsible for the archaeological record. Ideas that were traditionally established where Homo erectus and Homo habilis and Neanderthals and creatures like Homo heidelbergensis were making certain types of stone implements is now thrown into question because of the discovery of Homo naledi and where it appears in hominid natural history. New discoveries create chaos, not clarity. This to me is an indication that the paradigm is actually in trouble, and that the better way to think about the hominid fossil record is that these are creatures that were the product of a creator. And the mosaic properties that we see for some of these creatures reflect the fact that these creatures likely lived in an open savanna, woodland environment, mixed environment. They could have had the capacity to move through the trees, but also stand erect, where that would have been the ideal set of properties that would have allowed them to live in a mixed woodland, open savanna environment. In the same way that we could see the fishapod characteristics of these transitional forms, quote unquote, documenting the evolutionary transformation of lobe-finned fish into tetrapods as being sets of properties that would have made these creatures ideally suited to live at a water's edge, both on the land and in shallow water environments at the water's edge. So there's no reason, again, to see the hominid fossil record as this compelling evidence for human evolution. When we push on the details, what we see are problematic features. Now, what about the idea that this creature very well may have been engaged in mortuary practices, that it may very well have been caching its dead? As much as I am uncomfortable with that idea, it looks as if that was really what the evidence says. And the fact that these researchers discovered another cave site, or another chamber called the Lacetti Chamber, where it looks like there is caching of the dead here, where there's not evidence for washing into these cave sites, there's not evidence that there's any other way into these chambers, it looks like maybe these creatures were actually engaged in mortuary practices. But I think it's important not to conflate that with the fact that these creatures would have had symbolic capabilities, which is unique to humans, which I would argue is evidence for the image of God. Rather, these creatures were just simply processing their dead. And we see this already for other hominids like Homo heidelbergensis or Homo antecessor. It's not clear which hominid was responsible for the remains in the pit of bones found in Spain, the Cima de los Huesos. But it looks like this creature was essentially disposing of its dead in these pits. So this could have been a practice that was common among many hominins, not just Homo naledi or Homo antecessor / Homo heidelbergensis with respect to the pit of bones. We also see other creatures like elephants having graveyards. Chimpanzees have been observed mourning their dead. Neanderthals looked like they very well could have been burying their dead, but those burials don't appear to be ritualistic in nature. So processing the dead in mortuary practices, caching the dead, is a property that we see among many of the hominins, but it's a very different type of practice than actually having a funeral where there's a ritualistic event that takes place, a funeral practice at the time of burial, where there's a sense of an afterlife, where that individual is persisting in another dimension beyond this dimension that we live in. That is a set of sets of practices that seem to be unique to modern humans and reflect our symbolic capability and our theory of mind, and a sense that there is a reality beyond this physical material reality, properties that I would argue reflect, again, the image of God. So the fact that this creature was burying its dead doesn't really mean much. Interesting, fascinating, but in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't represent a challenge to a biblical perspective on human origins. So at the end of the day, this discovery of Homo naledi, I think, and the date for Homo naledi reflects a failed prediction of the evolutionary paradigm. It's highlighting how chaotic human evolutionary models are, how speculative these models are, and new discoveries overturn what seem to be well-established ideas, not only in terms of evolutionary relationships among the hominins, but even now, who's responsible for features of the archaeological record. This fact that things are so chaotic, to me, is, as a scientist, is an indication that the theory is unraveling, because sound scientific theories gain clarity, gain crystallization when new discoveries are made. They're not thrown into chaos. Well-established aspects of the ideas are not abandoned as new ideas are advanced. So again, I think that Homo naledi represents a case study for why, as an old Earth creationist, I'm not convinced that the hominid fossil record is compelling evidence for human evolution, and why I think, again, an old Earth creationist perspective can accommodate discoveries like Homo naledi so well by viewing them as part of God's creative history. Creatures that are enigmatic, to be certain, are fascinating creatures, to be clear, but there's nothing in the hominid fossil record that I think refutes an old Earth creationist position. So anyway, with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and bring this broadcast to a close. I'm going to remind everybody, if you're watching this, please react to the broadcast with the like button. Post in the comment section who you are, where you're watching from, and if you want to offer your thoughts or perspective on this discovery, please feel free to do that. And then lastly, what I would encourage you to do as well is to send me questions that you would like for me to consider for question of the week. You can send me the questions by posting them on my Facebook page, both my personal page or my public page. You can send me a message, private message me the questions, or you can even put the questions in the comment section here. And what I'll do is each week choose a question that I think is interesting and would be a broad appeal to people that are interested in science faith issues. If I don't choose your question, don't be disheartened, don't be discouraged. I read every question and I think about those questions, and many times those questions will influence the types of blog articles that I write about, or will even influence the talks that I develop, or give me ideas for potential book projects. So I pay a lot of attention to those questions, even though they don't make it to a Facebook Live session. Finally, one of the things that I think would be fun to do to make this broadcast more interesting, to sweeten the pot, is to offer people whose question I select for a Facebook Live session a free gift. And this week, Stephen Joyner, I'm going to send you a copy of my book, Who Was Adam?, which is a book that deals with the question of human origins from a biblical and a scientific perspective. This will be the expanded, updated edition of Who Was Adam that was published in 2014. So Stephen, if you send me through private messaging your contact information, an address, I will put in the mail a signed copy of Who Was Adam for you as a thank you to you for not only this week's question of the week, but also last week's question of the week. Again, you're the first person, Stephen, to have a back-to-back question of the week. It's a very impressive twofer. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that and see if maybe some of you other people watching this are up to the challenge. So anyway, with that fun aside, I just want to let everybody know how much I personally appreciate each and every one of you, your interest in what we're doing here at Reasons to Believe, your genuine friendship that you've expressed to me through your posts in private messages on Facebook. I value every one of you and grateful again for your interest in what I do at Reasons to Believe, and also your interest in our ministry here at Reasons to Believe. So I just want to say God bless you again and thank you. You are very, very valuable to us, and we don't take your friendship and your partnership and your interest in our ministry lightly. And then I just will bring everything to a close by reminding all of you that the more that we know about science, the more that we have reasons to believe. Until next time, God bless you.